Hi, I'm Mitch McDonald. Welcome to this edition of Supply Chain Spotlight. Today we're very pleased to be joined by good friend Steve Geary, who's president of Supply Chain Visions, a highly regarded consultancy that works in several supply chain areas, including aerospace and defense, among several others. Steve's also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Tennessee College of Business Administration and is on faculty at the prestigious Gordon Institute at Tufts University in Boston, where he teaches supply chain management. Finally, Steve is also editor-at-large at CSCMP Supply Chain Quarterly and our sister publication, DC Velocity, where he provides defense industry coverage both in feature stories and in his very popular defense logistics blog. For more than a decade, Steve's been engaged in a broad range of projects across aerospace and defense and is considered a thought leader in military logistics and weapons systems support. The topic today will be that, military logistics, how it exists, how it functions, and how it compares in contrast to the private sector. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's fun. Glad to get you in the seat. For close to 10 years, via our sister publication, DC Velocity, you've been sharing some really intriguing stories about the logistics aspect of the U.S. military and the Department of Defense. Our readers, who are for the most part in the commercial, the private sector, how do those stories illustrate similarities, or maybe even more important, differences between defense and commercial sector logistics?
I think the similarities are really strong.
Okay.
If you peel back any commercial business, I don't care what line of business that they're in, supply chain competency, if not excellence, is a core requirement for success in today's market.
Yep.
It's the same with the military, and it's been known for a long time. I learned a quote from General Rommel from World War II just a little while ago. And he said battles are fought and won by the quartermasters before the first shot is fired.
Yeah.
And so supply chain competency is both known, respected, and honored in both the military and the commercial sector. If I were to illustrate differences in perhaps what the commercial supply chain could learn from the military, there is a much higher emphasis on agility and resilience in supply chain within the military because it's core to their mission.
Sure.
They don't know what's coming tomorrow. And so as a result, there is an awful lot of work done, not just planning for the expected, but doing the scenario analysis to understand the unexpected.
Right. Has that become even a more significant part of defense logistics in recent years as we move to the so-called agile or mobile fighting force?
Absolutely, and if you trace it back to the threat environment, if we go back to the days of the Cold War, so we go back to, say, the late 80s, the world was defined in terms of state-on-state conflict.
Right.
Those days are gone.
Yep.
We don't know where the threat is coming from. We talk about this so-called proclaimed state, ISIS, but ISIS is not a state. It's a bunch of terrorists running around in the desert.
Yep.
They are not a state. There isn't anyone in the world that calls them a nation or even recognizes their existence, yet they have an army.
Yeah.
And that has essentially emerged out of nowhere over the course of the past several years. It is a new sort of threat environment. The 21st century threat environment is not the 20th century threat environment.
How about best practices military defense might be able to learn from the commercial sector? Efficiencies, anything. Let me state first, one of the things you made me very aware of early on when we started working together on some of this coverage is there's a whole different level of criticality. If Best Buy misses a shipment of Apple products and one of their stores is out of stock on an iPad, that's a business problem. If a warfighter pulls the trigger and no bullet comes out of the gun, that's a logistics issue on an entirely different scale. Having said that, are there things about efficiencies, best practices in the commercial sector that perhaps military logisticians could glean and benefit from?
The clock speed in the commercial supply chain arena is different.
Okay.
Markets move more quickly, technologies move more quickly, adoption rates are very rapid.
Yep.
And because of the nature of an organizational infrastructure, even let's look at a piece of the Department of Defense.
Right.
The United States Army has 500,000 people in uniform. Those are just the uniform folks. We're not talking about the civilians behind them. So change, adoption, and change management are on a totally different scale.
Yep.
And as a result, the military moves slowly.
Okay.
And sometimes they don't move quickly enough. What I like to say is that sometimes the military moves like a glacier, but glaciers move mountains.
Well said. I like that. Another thing that I learned from reading and observing your coverage in DC Velocity on defense logistics is something I was unaware of, and I think many folks also may not be. That is the extent to which Department of Defense logistics rely on services provided by commercial carriers. Could you explain that role and how the commercial sector actually is in fact supporting defense logistics already?
The commercial sector, certainly in times of conflict, provides the lion's share of lift to the military. They are certainly approaching 80 to 90% of ocean-going cargo in support of the battle space.
Yep.
They are a significant portion of the airlift, and they rely on chartered surface transportation whenever they can get it, even in the battle space. Now, the military is still generally responsible for what we call the last tactical mile.
Yep.
You don't hire Ahmed's Motor Express to drive to the battlefield,
Right.
but you may hire Ahmed to drive to the supply depot.
Sure.
That may be 6 miles away from the point of conflict. And so the evolution that's taken place in the military over the past decades is we rely on the commercial sector on demand when we need it. It's big enough and it's robust enough that if we need to move volumes, then we call commercial shippers.
It's there. Okay. We sit here, and we let the viewers know that it is September 22, 2014. Last night, American with some aligned Arab nations began airstrikes on ISIS holdings within Syria and possibly parts of Iraq. That's going on and very current in front of us. At the same time, we're in the midst of the drawdown in Afghanistan. On either or both of those functions, I know you've done some recent reporting with the General in charge of logistics at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What are some of the implications and important things that are going on within logistics as part of those activities?
Well, we have to make projections. So what I will share with you are my personal opinions
Sure.
of what's probably going on behind the scenes, because we're now engaged in battle.
Right.
So let's just say the United States military is probably not all that forthcoming on what moves they're making behind the scenes on logistics. We saw the point of the spear last evening.
Yep.
We've engaged now in Syria. We have been engaged in Iraq. And that is visible, that is known, that is understood. But trying to understand the infrastructure, the footprint, the logistics that's going on behind that, that's a point of vulnerability. People are not going to generally talk about that.
Yep.
But we can look at a map.
Yep.
And if we look at a map and the reporting that took place last evening, we know that we have Syria, which is the nexus of activity that's going on.
Right.
And participants last evening, this is probably not everyone, but we certainly had involvement from Jordan.
Yep.
Presumably we had involvement from Iraq.
Yep.
We had involvement from Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
And if you look at all of those on a map, with the exception of Turkey, we have surrounded Syria. Now, if we have combat cooperation taking place from those locations, it is likely that we have logistical cooperation taking place in each of those locations.
Okay.
We have footprint.
Yep.
Presumably, there are arrangements that have been made regarding access, regarding sharing of space,
Yep.
regarding sharing of logistics. There are things that we can do that our allies and friends and partners cannot do. We can project because of, although we rely on commercial, there is no military in the world that has the ability to project logistically the way the US military does.
Yep.
We have an Air Force. Not only do we have an Air Force, our fleet of C-17s has more aircraft than most air forces in the world. We have 200 and some odd C-17s. That's a lot of lift.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can get what needs to be gotten where it needs to be. I would guess that all of the plans and arrangements that have been made in advance by the Joint Staff, the partnerships, the base access agreements, the overflight agreements, came well into play both last evening and in the days leading up to it, so that everyone is appropriately supplied to deliver the punch.
Yep. Makes perfect sense. And I'd like to now touch on Afghanistan for a moment before we close. And to let the viewers know, you've had time on the ground.
Yes.
In Iraq. You've had time on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yes.
The drawdown in Afghanistan is underway.
Yes.
Any, from your observations or any of your reporting, observations on the ground or reporting, any lessons learned from that activity when it happened in Iraq that can or should be applied as it's happening in Afghanistan?
The environments from the two different locations are so distinct.
Infrastructure.
Everything from infrastructure to the cultures to the geography. There is not a one-for-one transference of lessons learned.
Okay.
By the time that we were exiting Iraq, we had available to us 3 different overland egress points. We could go up through Turkey, we could go out through Jordan, and we could go down through Kuwait. It is not the same in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. On one side we have Iran, probably not a viable means of egress. To the north we have the Central Asian republics, but on the other side of them you've got Russia, probably not our best friend these days. And then the other country surrounding is Pakistan. And let's just say that they're unpredictable. And so you put those things together, and the exit from Afghanistan has been very different and is very different from the exit from Iraq. Much heavier air reliance. Although we're not flying all the way back to the United States, we fly back to waypoints. So this is one of the first times I've ever seen a multimodal model that makes sense, that includes air, sea, rail, and truck all on one move. We fly out of Afghanistan, we perhaps go to Dubai, we flip over to ocean going, we go to one of the East Coast ports, it's offloaded onto trains, goes to one of the depots, and then perhaps onto a truck and on from there. Very different.
Based on the mainstream news reporting that a lot of the armaments ISIS is using in support of its crusade, are those left behind intended for use by the Iraqi government? Based on what's happened and them taking control and now using those weapons back against, to an extent, us and our allies, do you suspect less will be left behind in Afghanistan?
Less will be left behind, but for different reasons.
Okay.
The infrastructure is poor in Afghanistan in comparison with Iraq, in comparison with most other places on the face of the earth. And some of the equipment that the U.S. military is using, the ambush-protected vehicles, some of the Humvees, to us those may look like run-of-the-mill pieces of technology, but it's questionable whether or not the Afghans have the capability to even maintain them. And so there has been a higher degree of scrappage that's taken place because it is not cost effective to haul back to the United States an ambush-protected, mine-resistant vehicle. By the time you pay the freight to haul it back, you could buy a new one. And so much more material is being scrapped in Afghanistan than was scrapped in Iraq.
It's a fascinating topic, one for hours, but I'm going to limit myself to one more question. A few years ago, you had very good insight and in fact, some involvement in some of the changes under the Bush administration, Secretary Rumsfeld, in the new 21st century fighting force, the things we talked about earlier, deployment, speed, velocity, agility, so on and so forth. Has that initiative run its course successfully, or is there still more of a ways to go to have a military force that reflects the need of national security as it exists today?
Well, we have conflicting objectives right now,
Okay.
which makes the answer to that question unknown. On the one hand, we have a wider variety of threats that we have to be prepared for than we've ever been faced with before, all the way from the unconventional in Central Africa to the what has become of the Arab Spring across the north of Africa, to what's going on in Southwest Asia, to what is closer to conventional state-on-state in, say, the Ukraine, and then perhaps some other more conventional state-on-state threats. We continue to see unrest on the Pac Rim. You look at all of those things, and there's a wider portfolio than we've had before, active threats. Yet, the budget is being compressed, and if we execute the budget as required by law, we are going to end up with the smallest standing army since before World War II.
You're speaking of sequestration.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, politically, the nation has some decisions to make. Does it wish to pursue this broad-based national security strategy, or does it wish to have the smallest peacetime army since before World War II? That's a political decision, not a military decision. But right now, the military is being asked to make do with resources at pre-World War II levels and perform missions, a national security strategy far beyond that resource base. And it's an insolvable problem.
It is a political issue, but it's also a very risky issue, is it not?
It depends on what risk the nation wishes to absorb.
Right.
You get what you pay for.
Steve, thanks for the time. It's great
Thank you.
stuff. Talk to you soon.